President Trump setting the narrative for what he hopes the next 100 days will bring. And this morning, his campaign is making a splash, releasing a new ad highlighting the first 100 days.
America has rarely seen such success. A respected Supreme Court justice confirmed. Companies investing in American jobs again. America becoming more energy independent. Regulations that kill American jobs eliminated.
And it isn't just Republicans in campaign mode. Democrats are getting restless, too. Here's a moment from just yesterday in New Hampshire.
Guys, I'm not running, okay? I know it caused a lot of speculation.
Joining me now to look at the next 100 days and beyond, Democratic pollster Margie O'Mara and co-host of the Pollsters podcast and Republican pollster Chris Wilson. Chris, what struck me looking at that little clip was that it said, we've rarely seen such success. Donald Trump might actually say we've never seen such success. Is this kind of ad only speaking to the base, only preaching to the converted? And even if that's the case, is it important to keep them fired up?
Well, of course, it's important to keep them fired up. His opportunities to pass legislation moving forward is all about keeping the base excited. If at any point those voters, those Trump voters that turned out in one states, non-traditional Republican states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio, somehow are no longer supporters, then he'll see his entire legislative agenda collapse. So I think it's smart. I think Marjorie and I could probably debate for a while whether it's correct or not, but it is certainly the right thing for him to be doing. And frankly, I hope they're running it down in Georgia because there's a special election coming up in the Atlanta media market. That sort of messaging is important because if you see Republican base get depressed and not turn out, Democrats will win the old Newt Gingrich seat, and that would be a pretty strong message to send.
Yeah, and we've also seen people like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen who had just dropped out over the weekend. So, Margie, on the alternative, you saw what happened with Joe Biden. It's as if the Democrats are chomping at the bit to have an opportunity to even think of a world where Donald Trump isn't president. But there's a lot of time between now and the next election. So what should we be watching for on the Democratic side the next 100 days?
Well, you see Democrats across the country increasingly enthusiastic and excited about their political participation, whether that's voting, whether that's taking political action. The marches like the climate change march that was in Washington this past weekend and the science march the weekend before that. So you see a lot of folks on the left, really people running for office, record numbers of candidates running across the country. And all of that is a reflection on what people are seeing with President Trump and his first 100 days. I'm not surprised he's running an ad talking about his accomplishments and trying to make it seem like he's accomplished a lot, because that's actually one of his biggest vulnerabilities in the polling. Even with his own base, he's dropped on things like getting things done and keeping promises. We found that in our own poll. He's dropped 20 points with his own base on whether people think he's getting things done relative to expectations. Gallup and others have shown similar drops across the board, not just with Republicans, with Democrats, independents, you name it. So I'm not surprised he's trying to shore up that vulnerability that there's a perception that he hasn't really gotten anything done.
There are things that are beyond his control, and I'm thinking about the ongoing investigations into Russian meddling in the election. Here's what he had to say this weekend about that.
You don't think it's phony that the Russians tried to meddle in the election? You believe that?
I don't know.
You don't know, or you do know?
Well, I have a problem. You have Podesta, who, by the way, I understand has a company with his brother in Russia. Hillary's husband makes speeches in Russia. Hillary did a uranium deal with Russia. Knowing something about hacking, if you don't catch a hacker, okay, in the act, it's very hard to say who did the hacking. With that being said, I'll go along with Russia. Could have been China, could have been a lot of different groups.
He is still, Chris, talking about something that almost no one else is talking about. Virtually every other responsible member of Congress has talked about how it's clear that Russians tried to meddle in the election. What do you make of that, and will it matter?
Well, I don't think it matters. And the challenge is, if you read the book that's sort of the autopsy on the Clinton campaign, Shattered by Mike Allen, it shows that coming out of the campaign, the Clinton staff had to have a message as to why they lost. They couldn't say we lost because we had a bad candidate. They couldn't say we lost because the American people disagreed with us or we ran a bad campaign. They had to find a reason. And so they got together and they decided they were going to push out this Russian hacking story. And the fact is,
House and Senate committees are not doing this investigation. The FBI is not doing an investigation because the Hillary Clinton campaign put out a narrative.
Well, I think if we look at an email that actually had an effect on the election, it was the email that was taken from Anthony Weiner's laptop when the FBI was investigating. That was what James Comey was talking about the weekend before the election. And I think you can make an argument that that had an impact on how people voted. But to say that somehow, I'm not going to argue that hacking did not take place from Russia. I don't have that knowledge. But I will say that I think it had zero impact on the election. If there are emails that did have an impact on the election, again, it was the email that was found on Anthony Weiner's laptop as part of his sexting with underage kids that was then found by investigators and talked about by James Comey. And that's really what affected the election. The whole idea that the Russian hacking affected the election is simply it's a narrative being pushed by the Clinton campaign that lost. And it's unfortunate because it's distracting from what I think is probably an important investigation into the Russian attempted hacking and attempted influence on the election. But when it gets down to it, it really had zero impact on what happened in November and Trump's victory.
Well, Margie, you know, one of the criticisms of the Trump administration, granted there were many over the first 100 days, but that he tried to take on too many things, that there wasn't a sharp focus, and that now he needs to have a more sort of defined plan about how to move forward. And there is a lot going on. You do have this Russia investigation. You have the growing concerns, the growing anxiety about what's happening on the Korea Peninsula. Just this week, you have the budget. You have health care. You have questions about immigration and building the wall. Would the Democrats be well served as well to focus their attention elsewhere, let the FBI, let the committees do their business and focus on policy?
Well, when it comes to Russia and it comes to meddling in our election, I mean, this is really the cornerstone of our democracy, is having free and open and transparent elections. It's something, that's not just my belief. That's what polls show, a very unifying bipartisan belief. And I think it's really disgraceful that there are folks of any party in any part of the administration or in any part of our political dialogue who are trying to kind of muddy the waters on this and say it doesn't really matter. This is something that has been in the public dialogue well before the election. It came up in the debates. It was, it was being discussed months before the election. It's something that we need to get to the bottom to. Of course, there are other issues to discuss, but for us to not protect and defend our elections from international threats, I mean, how can we not all unify behind that?
Let's go back to Joe Biden, because there was a lot of enthusiasm for him, and now he's speaking from a very different place. Here's something he had to say yesterday, kind of advice for members of his own party.
Ask yourself the rhetorical question: what made you a Democrat in the first place? Not a joke. Not a joke. What made you a Democrat? Why did you choose to be a Democrat? There's three core values that are actually missing today. The first is dignity. The second is thinking big. I don't think it takes a long time to do great things. And the last piece is optimism. So many people are walking around, woe is me, give me a break.
In some ways, do we think perhaps, Chris, that this is a message for Congress overall, a group that is less popular than the president, who is at historically low levels, that they need to think big and get things done? Is that sort of a message going forward if they want to look toward 2018 and either side making any progress?
Well, it is. I mean, Biden is right. And in fact, if you look at the party that has represented optimism in the past, is the one that usually wins. I mean, I would argue that was Reagan's shining city on a hill. It's one of the reasons why Bill Clinton did so well in the 90s. It's why George W. Bush did well in 2000s. And I don't think there's any question Barack Obama represented optimism. I mean, the question is, if you look at what message coming out of the last election was about optimism, is it stronger together or make America great again? And I think that's one of the reasons why Trump won, is because he was able to capture in those middle-class voters what optimism was. was. And Biden's message, frankly, is one that should be heard by both parties, because whoever goes into 2018 representing the optimism of where we can go together as a country, that's the party that's going to be successful in the next election cycle. And we can argue all day about issues, but whether we should repeal Obamacare or replace Obamacare, whether we should pass tax cuts or raise taxes and spend more, I mean, all these are important debates to have. But I think Joe Biden's message should be heard by both parties. I think the more interesting aspect of it is the Democratic Party has become a party that is better represented, and they get excited about a past vice president rather than someone who should be a future leader.
Well, I think all the Democrats are going to be 20 years from now still excited to see Joe Biden. But Chris Wilson, Margie O'Mara, thanks to both of you. And after the break, holding Hollywood hostage.